She had spent the last of the money on the ticket, which was a thing she had done on purpose, so that when the train slowed for the water tower and a town she had never seen swung up alongside the window, there would be no part of her still calculating the fare back. The town was called Maitland Crossing. She knew that much from the letter, and from the painted board, nailed to the end of the station house, the paint blistered gray on its south face where the prairie sun had got at it, summer after summer. 3 buildings of any seriousness stood along the one street. A grain elevator at the far end, red, with the rail siding running up against it. A store with a false front taller than the building behind it. A hall that might have been a church on Sundays and a meeting place the rest of the week, judging by the size of the stovepipe. She stepped down onto the platform, and the wind took the hem of her coat at once, came at her low and steady out of the northwest, with nothing between it and her but 400 miles of cut wheat and slough grass October. The light already long by mid-afternoon, the color of weak tea. She set her bag down, not because it was heavy, but because she wanted both hands free to hold her hat, and she stood there a moment and let the place look at her. A man came out of the elevator office wiping his hands and looked, then went back in. A woman crossing toward the store with a basket looked and did not stop looking until she was at the store door. That was all right. She had been looked at before, in towns smaller than this and meaner. She picked up her bag and went into the store. It was dim after the brightness outside and smelled of coal oil and dry goods, and the licorice they kept in a jar by the scale. A woman stood behind the counter, entering figures in a ledger with a pencil she had to keep wetting at her lip. She did not look up at once. When she did, her face was not unfriendly, only careful, the face of a person who had watched a great many strangers come through that door and turn out to want something she would have to fetch from the back. "Come in on the train," the woman said. It was not quite a question. She said she had. She said she was looking for a man and gave the name from the letter, and the woman behind the counter, whose own name proved to be Mrs. Ledoux, set down her pencil. "He's out on his quarter," Mrs. Ledoux said. "West and a little north, past the Stenberg place, where the poplars come down to the slough. He's putting up a house out there before the freeze." She paused, and her eyes went, in spite of themselves, to the bag by the door. "You'll be the one he rode away for, to help through the building." "Yes," she said. Mrs. Ledoux nodded slowly, as if a thing she had been told about had now turned up in the flesh, which it had. "You'll want to wait for him to come in. He'll bring the wagon at dusk most evenings for the girl." And seeing the question form, she added, "He's got a little one. Goes on 5. Pearl. Her mother's been gone 2 winters now. So, there was a child." She had not known that. The letter had said the work and the wage, and where to come, and nothing of a child, which told her something about the man, that he thought a child was not a thing you put in a letter to a stranger, that it was a thing you let her find out when she stood in front of it. She filed that away. "I'll wait," she said. She set her bag in the corner by the cold stove where it would not be underfoot, and stood at the window that faced the street, and watched the light go off the false fronts, one by one. Mrs. Ledoux returned to her ledger. A boy came in for a spool of thread his mother wanted, and stared at her the whole time the thread was being found and counted, and did not stop until the door shut behind him. The licorice smell, the wind worrying the loose tin on the store roof. She had 4 months of travel behind her, and a coat that had been good once, and a way of standing so still that people forgot after a while that she was there. The wagon came at dusk. She heard it before she saw it, the dry creak of the axle and the horse's feet on the hard road, and she did not move from the window. He pulled up in front of the store and got down and looped the lines and lifted the child down off the seat before he did anything else, which she noticed. He was a tall man going lean the way men go, who do their own labor, a few years past 30, a week of beard on him, and sawdust in the creases of his coat. The little girl ran ahead of him into the store and stopped dead when she saw the stranger by the window and put her back against her father's leg as he came through the door. "Evening, Mrs. Ledoux," he said, and then he saw the bag in the corner, and then he saw her, and he understood, and something in his face that had been open closed itself part way, not unkindly, the way a man's face does when he is reminded that the easy part of a thing is over and the hard part is in the room with him. "You wrote for help with the build," she said. She did not make it a question either. She had learned that from somewhere. "I did." He took his hat off, which she also noticed. It's a good way out. There's no proper road past the Stenbergs, only the trail. It's rough work and rougher quarters than you'll have been used to. I haven't been used to soft quarters in some years, she said. He looked at her then, properly, for the length of time it takes to decide a thing, and the child looked up at her too, from the shelter of his leg, with the flat, unembarrassed stare that small children have. The girl had her father's dark hair and someone else's gray eyes. She had a button missing from her coat. Thread end where it had been was still there, frayed as if it had come off recently and no one had got to it. It's getting on, he said. We'll go out tonight and you can see it in the morning and tell me then if it'll do. It'll do, she said. He almost smiled. You haven't seen it. No, she agreed. But I've come a long way to see it, and I won't have come all that way to turn around because it's rough. He put his hat back on. He picked up her bag before she could and carried it out and stowed it in the box of the wagon. And he lifted the child up onto the seat and then stood a moment considering and offered his hand to help her up. She took it. His hand was hard across the palm and careful, the grip of a man who has crushed things by accident before and learned not to. They went out of town with the last of the light in the west, going from gold to the deep red that means cold weather coming, and the dark coming up out of the east behind them, and the road turning to trail past the last fence, the wagon dropping into the ruts and climbing out of them, the child between them on the seat, warm against her arm, and already half asleep before the town was out of sight. The house sat at the top of a long rise, where a tongue of poplar bluff came down to meet a slough, and even by lantern light, when they came up on it, she could see that it was being built by a man who knew exactly what he was doing and was in no hurry to be praised for it. The frame stood square against the sky. The first story was closed in, sided and roofed, and a single window showed yellow where a fire had been banked in the cook stove. The upper story was open still, rafters only, the ribs of it black against the stars that were coming out hard and cold the way they only do out there, where there is no other light to argue with them. There was an old man at the fire when they came in, a hired neighbor named Stenberg, who had been keeping the place and minding nothing in particular. And he took his leave the moment they arrived, glad to be quit of it, and rode off into the dark on a horse that knew the way better than he did, that left the three of them. The man carried the sleeping child up the ladder stair to a curtained-off corner of the loft where a small bed was made, and came down and showed her where she would sleep. A room off the kitchen that had been meant for a pantry and had a cot in it, and a nail to hang her things and a window the size of a book. She said it would do. He banked the fire and said good night and went up, and she sat a while in the dark on the edge of the cot with her coat still on, and listened to the new house tick and settle around her in the cold, and to the wind in the poplars, and to nothing else at all, which, after 4 months of trains and depots and other people's coughing, was the loudest thing she had heard in a long time. She had been a wife. She did not think about it most days, because thinking about it was a door that opened onto a long, cold hall, and she had learned to walk past it. There had been a man, and there had been, briefly, the promise of a child, and then there had been a fever that came through the river camps one spring and took the both of them inside a single week and left her standing. She had buried them on a hill above a town she never went back to, and she had worked her way north and west ever since, cooking in camps and minding other women's houses, drawn always toward the edge of things, toward the places where the country had not finished being made yet, because finished places had no use for a woman who was still herself in the middle of being made over into whatever she would become now. The letter had been pinned to the wall of a land office in a town she had stopped in only for the night. A man wanted help to finish a house before winter. The wage was fair and the place was far. She had written back the same hour. She lay down at last in her coat and slept without meaning to. In the morning she saw the place plain, and it was better than the letter, and better than the dark had let her guess. He had chosen his ground well. The rise kept the house up out of the spring melt. The bluff broke the worst of the north wind. The slough would have ducks in it spring and fall and ice to cut in winter. The house itself, what there was of it, was made the way a thing is made, by a man who intends to die in it. The joints were tight. The boards were planed. He had used good wood and used it carefully, and there was very little of it lying wasted anywhere about, which was the surest sign she knew of a serious man. She found the child first. Pearl was up before her father, sitting on the bottom step of the ladder stair in a nightgown with her boots on the wrong feet, watching the door of the pantry room with the patience of a cat at a hole. When the door opened, the girl did not run away this time. She stayed where she was and watched. "You're going to make breakfast," the child said. It was not a question. She had her father's way of not making things questions when they did not need to be. "I am," she said, "if you'll show me where things are kept." This was the right thing to have said, she saw at once, because the child slid off the step and took her by the hand with no ceremony at all, and led her about the half-built kitchen, pointing out the flour barrel, and the crock of eggs packed in oats, and the slab of bacon hung in the cold porch, and the place where the good knife lived, which was up high, away from Pearl on account of the time with the apple, the details of which were given at length while the fire was got going. The child talked the way children talk who have spent too much time with grown men who do not, filling all the silence at once, now that there was someone to pour it into. Her mother had had yellow hair. Her mother had sung a song about a goose. The Stenberg dog had 8 pups, and her father said no. The window in the loft had a crack, and you could see your breath. She, Pearl, was going to be 5 at Christmas, and then she would be allowed to carry the eggs. By the time the man came down, the bacon was on, and the child was set up at the table with a bowl of the previous day's porridge warmed over. And he stood at the foot of the stair a moment taking it in, the fire up and the kettle going, and his daughter talking, and a stranger at his stove. And she watched him take it in and watched him decide to say anything about it, which she respected. He sat. He ate what she put in front of him. He said it was good once, plainly, and meant it, and that was all the conversation there was. And it suited her down to the ground. She had not been hired to build, but she built. The first day she kept to the house, set it to rights, took the measure of what was there and what was wanting, learned where the cold came in, and stuffed the worst gaps with rag and tow against the day it would matter. But the house was small, and she was quick, and by afternoon she had run out of indoor work, and she went out to where he was framing the upper story and stood at the foot of the wall and watched him for a while. The way he set a board, and sighted it and set it again, and after a time she said, "You're a hand short." He looked down at her from the staging. "I am. Stenberg's no good to you up there." "Stenberg's afraid of heights and a fool besides," he said, but he was the only man free this side of the elevator. He considered her. "It's not work for." And then he stopped himself, because he had looked at her hands where they held the bottom of the ladder, and seen that they were not soft hands. They were hands that had wrung wash and gutted fish, and split kindling in the cold, working hands. And he changed what he had been going to say. "It's high," he said instead. "I've been high," she said. "I'm not afraid of it," so she went up. And she was not a builder and never pretended to be, but she could hold a board true while he nailed it. And she could hand him what he wanted before he had finished asking for it. And she had a steady way of being up on the staging that did not jar the work. And by the end of that first afternoon, they had got more done than he had done in 3 days with the old man, and they both knew it, and neither of them said so. The child played below them in the wood scraps and the long grass, building her own small houses out of offcuts, narrating to herself. Now and again the man would look down to find her, a quick check, no more, and find her, and go back to the work. She marked that too. A man could be measured, she had long ago decided, by where his eyes went when he thought no one was watching, and his went every few minutes to the small dark head in the grass below, and came back satisfied. The days fell into an order that did not need to be discussed. She was up first and got the fire and the breakfast. He saw to the horse in the stock. There was a cow, a few hens, a pig being fattened against the killing weather. Pearl was the bridge between them, carrying messages neither of them had quite sent, reporting to each what the other had said, inventing the rest. The work on the house went up. The mornings came harder and whiter, frost on the inside of the little window now, the sloe skinning over at its edges, and the ducks gone south in long, ragged strings she watched from the staging, going where she had no wish to follow. She learned the order of his tools without being taught it. Planes first in the box, then the spokeshave and the brace and the bits, Then the saws laid flat on a folded cloth so the teeth would not ride against one another. The first evening she packed up the staging, she did it in that order without thinking, and he watched her do it and said nothing, but she saw him see it. She learned, too, the shape of his grief, which was a thing he carried the way she carried hers, folded small and put away where it would not be in the road. He did not speak of the dead wife, but the house told on him. There were two of everything where there might have been one. 2 windows to the south where one would have lit the room, a porch wider than a single person would ever need, a second small room off the loft, unbuilt as yet but framed for, that could only have been meant, once, for a child that had not come and now never would. He was building a house for a family that the fever had taken before the house was a house. He had not changed the plan. She understood that. You did not change the plan. You built the house the dead had wanted because the house was the last argument you had left with them, and you meant to win it. On the 4th day the weather broke. It had been coming. She had felt it in her bad shoulder since morning, and seen it in the way the cattle stood. And by noon, the sky in the northwest had gone the color of a bruise, and the wind had swung around and begun to come in hard gusts that snatched at the loose roofing they had not yet got nailed down. The man looked at the sky and looked at the open south wall of the upper story, framed but not yet sheathed, and she saw him do the sum that she had already done, which was that if the storm came in the night and found that wall open, the wind would get up under the half-laid roof and take the whole upper story, maybe 4 days' work and the better part of his lumber, gone across the prairie in the dark. We sheath the south wall, he said, or we lose the roof. There was not light enough left in the day to do it slow, so they did it fast, and it was the hardest work she had done in years. He cut and she carried. He set and she held. The wind came at them in slaps that made the whole staging hum, and the cold came down with the dark, and her hands went past pain into a kind of clumsiness she had to fight, fumbling the nails. And twice she nearly went off the staging, and twice his hand was there at her arm, without his seeming to have moved, hard and sure, setting her back. They did not talk except for the work. Board, hold, here, ready. The short, flat words of 2 people doing one thing with 4 hands. The child they had wrapped in a quilt and set inside by the stove with strict orders not to stir. And every so often the small face would appear at the lit window below, watching the 2 of them up there in the wind against the failing sky. And then her father's voice would send it back, and it would go. They got the last board up in full dark by lantern light, with the first hard pellets of snow already rattling against the new wall. And they came down the ladder with their arms gone to lead, and stood a moment in the lee of the house they had just closed against the storm, breathing, the wind howling over the roof now, and finding it whole, finding no way in. And she felt something she had not let herself feel in a long time, which was the particular fierce gladness of having held a thing against the dark and won. He turned to her in the lantern light. There was snow caught in his beard, and his hands were shaking with cold and effort the same as hers. And he looked at her, the way he had looked at her in the store. That first evening, the long deciding look, except that something had changed behind it now, had been changing for 4 days, and they both knew that too. You'll freeze, he said. Get in by the fire. That was all he said. But he stood and watched her go in. And he did not come in himself for a while. And through the little window she saw him out there in the snow with the lantern, walking the foot of the new wall, running his hand along the joint they had made, checking the work the way other men check on the safety of someone they love, and finding it sound. The storm blew 3 days, and they were shut in together while it did. And that was the part she had not bargained on, the closeness of it, the 3 of them in the one warm room with the white roaring past the windows, and nowhere in the world to be but there. She had braced for hardship. She had not braced for this. The child fell asleep in her lap on the 2nd afternoon, while she was mending the coat with the missing button, sewing a new one on out of the button box, and she sat very still so as not to wake her, and felt the small weight of her and the warmth, and did not look up, because she knew the man was watching from across the room, and she did not trust her own face just then. She had buried the only child that was ever going to be hers, before it had drawn a breath. She had made her peace with the cold hall and the closed door. And here was a fever-orphaned girl from a dead mother asleep against her with her mouth open, trusting her absolutely the way children trust, with no idea what it cost. "She doesn't take to people," the man said quietly, across the room. "As a rule, no," she said. "She's taken to you." She did not answer that. There was nothing to add to it. That would not be more than she could stand to say out loud. She finished the button and bit the thread and set the coat aside and went on sitting there, holding the sleeping child, looking at the fire, while outside the storm wore itself down to nothing and the country went white and silent to every edge. The morning the snow stopped, the world was changed and clean and blinding, and the house stood up out of it square and sound and whole, the roof on, the walls tight, smoke going straight up out of the chimney into a sky gone hard, cold blue. The build was but for the inside finishing done. There was no more reason for her to stay. They both knew the count of it. He had hired her through the building, and the building was over. He came in from seeing to the stock and stamped the snow off, and stood at the door a while, not taking his coat off. And she knew what was coming, or thought she did, and had her face ready for it. The face that had heard 100 times that the work was finished and the wage was here, and the trail was that way. The face that did not let anyone see it land. "The Halloran's barn burned in the fall," he said. "I'm to raise them a new one come spring. And there's the finishing here, the inside, the upstairs rooms. There's a winter of work in this house alone." He stopped. He turned his hat in his hands. He was not a man to whom words came easy, and she watched him reach for them and not find the ones he wanted, and decide, in the end, to use plain ones, because plain ones were what he had. "I could use a hand who knows the work," he said. Through the winter. And after. The fire ticked. The child, on the floor between them, had gone still, listening, in the way children go still when they understand that something is being decided over their heads that they very much want to come out one way and not the other. "And after," she repeated. Not a question. She had learned that from him. "And after," he said, and looked at her and did not look away, and let the words sit there in the warm room with the white light coming off the snow through the south windows he had built for a wife who never lived to stand in it. And he gave her room to decline it. The way he gave everything room, asked nothing of her, she did not have a clear answer to, and waited without filling the quiet. She looked at the floor they would lay together that winter, board by board. She looked at the child on the rug who was holding her breath. She looked at the man who had carried her bag the first night and put his daughter down off the wagon before he did anything else, and whose eyes went, always, to wherever the small ones in his care had got to. She thought of the long, cold hall and the closed door she had walked past for 2 years, and she found, standing in that bright room, that the door had quietly come open at some point in the last 7 days, and that what was on the other side of it was not the dead after all, but only this. A house on a rise above a frozen slough and work to do, and a child who had taken to her, and a man waiting with his hat in his hands for an answer he had not let himself hope for. "All right," she said. The child let her breath out all at once and made a sound like a kettle and flung herself across the rug and against her, and she put her hand on the dark head without thinking, the way you put your hand on something that is yours. And over the small head she met the man's eyes, and he was smiling now, the smile he had nearly given her that first night in the store and held back, and he did not hold it back this time. He did not cross the room and take her in his arms. That was not how he did things, and not how she would have wanted it. He set his hat on the peg by the door, the gesture of a man unpacking rather than going, and he said, "I'll get the upstairs stove lit then. It'll want to be warm up there if you're stopping." And he went up the ladder stair to make the cold rooms warm, and she sat by the fire with the child in her arms, in the house they had closed against the storm, and outside the snow lay unbroken and shining all the way to the rim of the world. And the smoke from both chimneys now went up straight and steady into the high blue cold. And there was, for the first time in a long time, nowhere else she was trying to get to.